Now, today's daf is daf mem. That's a round number. And we'll finish up the Mishnah, which we did yesterday. Just review. Shnayim ochsin v'sakin v'shochtin. So two people are holding on to the same knife. And you might say that the shechita is a result of the partnership between the two of them, meaning each one is participating in the shechita. And therefore, Echad, if one of them had l'shem echad mikol elu for the sake of the mountains or the rivers and so forth, it was avodah zarah. The echad l'shem davar kosher. The other one had a very good intention. Nevertheless, shchitaso psula. Why? Because since the shchita is a sachakol, it's at the end of the day a partnership, and one of the two partners had in mind for avodah zarah, therefore it has the status of avodah zarah. Rashi goes on to add a point over here that if, for example, you had two people shechting separately with two knives, but simultaneously at the same time, then for sure it would be possible because you can identify already one of the shochtim who had l'shem harim, l'shem gvos, naharos, etc., as an independent shochet. So that for sure would be avodah zarah. So the Gemara now is medayik psula in zivche mesim lo. The Mishnah says that although the shechita was l'shem harim, l'shem gvos, etc., for the sake of avodah zarah, it's psula. But why didn't the Mishnah go a little bit further and tell me a greater chiddush that it's zivche mesim, meaning that it's a chefta of avodah zarah that's asur b'hana. So that would mean that you can't take the meat and sell it or have any benefit from it. So the answer is apparently, and this is based on a Gemara in Masechta Avodah Zarah that darshans a pasuk that says al hahorim, that an object of idolatry has to be al hahorim, but not the harim themselves, meaning anything that in nature is set in its place and it's immovable does not become a chefta of avodah zarah with an isur hana. I mean, could you imagine if the sun is worshipped by, the sun idolaters, and now we could never benefit from the sun? So that's impossible. But on the other hand, it was an object of avodah zarah, and the Gemara thinks that in such a case, although the idolater himself is certainly guilty of idol worship and he incurs the death penalty, but nevertheless the mountain itself, the chefta of the mountain, does not become zivche mesim because, as we said before, al haharim v'lo haharim atzmam uraminhu. And yet we have a brisa that explicitly contradicts this conclusion. Hashochet l'shum harim, l'shum gvos, l'shum naharos, l'shum midbaros, l'shum chama ulevana, l'shum kochav mazalos. So in all the above cases, the shechita was for the sake of something that's natural and immovable, whether it's mountains or rivers or deserts or the sun or the moon, the stars and the constellations. But now we get to something a little bit more abstract. That's not kavua in the physical nature, and that's l'shum Michael's asar hagadol. I have no clue who this Michael is. I don't know if it's a product of idolatry or we really believe there is some sort of an angel by the name Michael. I don't know. In any event, here now we're not talking about an object. We're talking about a deity, or shall we say, a being. L'shum shilshul katan, which means he's going from the greatest in nature, the mountains and the stars and so forth, to the lowest worm, tiny worm in nature. And in all the above cases, harei zivchei mesim, which means that there's an isur hana. because Zivchei Mesim means that just like you're not allowed to have hanoah from a mess, from a corpse, so too you're not allowed to have hanoah from something that was worshipped and has the status of avodah zarah. And that's against our Mishnah because our Mishnah says psula, implying that it's not Zivchei Mesim. Omer Abai lo kasha. Hadi omer lahar, hadi omer legado dehar. The word gada means the angel that supervises that mountain. He is the guardian spirit of the mountain. It's not a fixed object that's physically, established in one place in nature, but rather it's some sort of abstract spirit, and therefore it generates a shem zivche mesim with an isra hanoah, because now it's like Eloheim al hahorim, they're gods over the mountains, meaning they're guardian spirits that guide the mountains. And the Gemara supports this by saying, Dekonami, if you read the Brisa meticulously, the Kanani Dumya de Michal Sar Hagadol, in this whole series of examples, he has here the example of Michal Sar Hagadol, who's clearly not a fixed object, but rather is some sort of a celestial guardian spirit. Shmamina, so we assume that all the other cases of mountains, hills, and rivers, and stars, and sun, and so forth, so it's all for the spirit of those entities, and they're not fixed, and therefore the halacha of zivchei mesim will kick in. Now it's interesting that the case of shilshul katan, which is a tiny worm, is a living creature, and the Gemara in Masechta Tmura establishes that a living creature does not become an object of avodah zarah, even if it was worshipped. So why then, if you shecht an animal for the sake of a tiny worm, which is a live creature, why is that considered an idolatrous sacrifice? The tiny worm itself does not become the object of idolatry because it's a live entity, a live being. How does the animal that was slaughtered for the sake of a live being become avodah zarah? And apparently the answer is that although a live creature does not become a cheft of avodah zarah that generates an iser to be nene from the object, but the Torah does call it and consider it a chefta of avodah zarah, so it doesn't generate that isurim, and therefore when you shecht the carbon for the sake of this living creature, then since the Torah considers that living creature as an object of idolatry, like for example, we find that the animals that were worshipped by the Egyptians, by the Mitzrim, are called To'eva, which means a pagan deity. So the Torah says that that's considered a shechita for the sake of an entity of avodah zarah, even though again that entity does not become a chefza of isura. So now we get back to the case of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all these idolaters, worship these bodies, and the Torah allows us to benefit from the sun, the light of and the heat of these celestial spheres, and yet the Brisa says that we list all these cases of the sun and the moon and the stars as entities whose carbon will become forbidden. So once again, what we're going to say is the same distinction, that although the sun, the moon, and the stars cannot become a chefta of zivchei mesim to generate an Isra Hana such we can't benefit from the light and the warmth of the sun, but nevertheless, anything that was shechted for the sake of the sun, the moon, and the stars, or at least in the case of the guardian angel of the sun, the moon, and the stars, that carbon becomes forbidden as an object, a chefta of avodah zarah and in zivchei mesim. Okay, now Omer Rav Huna. Hoisa behemas chavero revutzel lifnei avodas kochav. Now, literally translated, revutzel lifnei avodas kochav means that the animal is lying flat on its back in front of their idol. But the truth is, as Rashi points out, it's lav dafka. The Gemara is just giving, let's say, a common example, a common case. So what he does is that when he shechts the animal, and he has in mind to shecht it for the sake of an avodah zarah, for this idol. Again, in the common case, the animal that's being slaughtered is lying right in front of the idol. Comes along Rav Huna, and he's mechadish that kevan sheshacha basiman echad asara, that although he hasn't shechted two simanim, and rather he only shechted one siman, and that shechita was done for the sake of avodah zarah, then it already generates an iser in the animal. And that means the animal becomes zivchei mesim, and it's aser bana, even though he did only half of an action, not a full action of avodah zarah, because the ultimate shechita has to be two simanim, and he only shechted one siman. And already at that point, when he shechts one siman, according to Rav Huna, excuse me, it becomes zivchei mesim. And the underlying principle here of Rav Huna is that you can generate a chefta d'isur on an animal as a result of an intention for the sake of avodah zarah, even though it's behemas chavero. Why? Because when we say that ein adam oser behemas chavero, or in general, ein adam oser dover shein shelo, that's only without a maisa. But if he does a maisa in the object, then that maisa in the object, even though it's not his, is considered as if it is his, and therefore he can generate this isur in this case of zivchei mesim, the isur of avodah zarah, and the isur hana therein. And even though he only shechted one siman, nevertheless, if we consider it as if it was his, and even though it's not his technically, but we consider it as if it's his because he did a maisa of avodah zarah in the object, then therefore, even if he does part of a maisa, and doesn't complete the maisa, he didn't shech both simanim, it still generates the isra avodah zarah. So the chiddush of Rav Huna is that even though it's not his behemas chavero, and even though he didn't complete the entire action, he only did part of the action, namely one siman, nevertheless it already generates an isur of zivchei mesim, an isur hana, and a chefta of avodah zarah. And Rav Huna is telling us that because he did an action in the object, as we said before, then he can render an isur even on something that's einu shalo, it's not his. And again, there's a double chiddush here because even though he only shechted one siman, so he didn't do a complete action. Now, what's going to happen is that the very moment he shechts one siman, the behema, the animal, is no longer roy lemizbeach. It's possible. because he's already generated the Isser of Avodah Zarah, and the Isser of Avodah Zarah will passel the carbon. And therefore, if he does this bachutz, he will not generate an Isser of Shchutei Chutz, because the Shchutei Chutz is when he shechts the second simon, and already at the point of the first simon, the animal is passel in Mizbeah. And Shchutei Chutz generates an Isser Kares and a Chiyuv Chatos Peshogig only in a case where the carbon itself is kosher, but he just shechts it outside of the Mikdash. And that's what's going to be the Gemara's attack against Rav Kahana, against Rav Huna, Eisvei Rav Nachman, Rav Huna. How do you square with this price? Hashochei Chatos B'Shabbos Bachutz Lavodas Kol Chavim Chayiv Shalosh Chatos. Watch what happens now. Number one, he shechted on Shabbos. Shchit on Shabbos itself generates a chiyuv, just 1 second, sorry. Right. A chiyuv chatos, because shchita is one of the 39 malachos. And on top of that, he shechted for Avodah Zarah. So he's chayav a chatos for shchitas Avodah Zarah. And he did a bachutz. So he's chayav a third chatos for shchutei chutz. Now, there's a whole issue here why he should be chayav for Chil Shabbos if this is a mekalkel and not a metaken. But be that as it may, all this is against Rav Huna. Why? Because the very moment that he shechted one simon, he already generated a shame avodas kol chavim on the animal. Therefore, the animal is possible as a carbon. And if that be the case, he can't be chayav for shchutei chutz. Asara is a shchutei chutz lo mechayev. You can't be chayav for shchutei chutz unless the carbon is kosher, and you're imitating that which would be meaningful and valid inside the mikdash, outside the mikdash. But here, already at the point that he shechted the first simon, the animal became forbidden, and it's a chefetz of avodah zarah, and therefore it's possible as a carbon. How could he therefore incur a chiyuv kares and a chiyuv chatos for chutz when he shechts the second simon?